The knife was already at her throat before Victoria realized she'd stepped in front of it. "Touch her again," Victoria said, voice shaking but her spine straight as a blade, "and I swear you'll regret it." The man laughing at her, the one who just knocked a bag of rice out of an old woman's trembling hands and spat at her feet, stopped laughing. Behind him, 3 more men in black straightened up, and somewhere in the shadow of the market awning, a pair of eyes she hadn't noticed yet went very, very still. He was watching. He'd been watching his mother be humiliated in the middle of Seoul's busiest market, and he hadn't moved, not because he didn't care, but because he wanted to see how far it would go before someone else did what his men should have already done. And then this girl, this stranger, this foreigner with fire in her spine, had thrown herself between his mother and a blade. He would remember her face for the rest of his life. If you're watching this and you love a slow-burn romance where danger and tenderness live in the same heartbeat, comment your country and the time you're watching this from, then hit subscribe right now before the story pulls you under. You don't want to miss what happens next. Victoria had been in Seoul for exactly 6 weeks. She'd come from Lagos with 2 suitcases, a scholarship letter clutched like scripture, and a promise to her mother that she would make something of herself. Graduate studies in international business, a language she was still stumbling through, and a part-time job translating for African traders at Namdaemun Market, that was her life now. Loud, foreign, exhausting, beautiful. She liked the market best in the early evenings, when the smell of grilled fish mixed with ginger, and the vendors called out prices in a rhythm she was slowly learning to sing along to. She liked the old woman 2 stalls down from where she worked Halmoni's song. Everyone called her, though Victoria didn't know if that was her real name or just what the market called grandmothers. The old woman sold pickled vegetables and always slipped Victoria an extra portion of kimchi, waving away her attempts to pay with a scolding click of her tongue. So when Victoria turned the corner that Tuesday evening and saw 4 men in black surrounding Halmoni's song stall, her stomach dropped before her mind even caught up. "You're 3 weeks behind," one of the men was saying, voice flat, bored, cruel in the particular way of men who'd said the same threat 100 times before. "Mr. Choi doesn't like being kept waiting." "I told your boss I'll have it by Friday," Halmoni's song started, and that was when the man knocked the bag from her hands. Rice scattered across the wet pavement like something spilling out of her chest. Victoria didn't remember deciding to move. 1 second she was frozen at the corner. The next she was between the old woman and the blade one of the men had drawn, not even really drawn, more like flicked open with the casual cruelty of someone showing off. "Touch her again," Victoria said, "and I swear you'll regret it." The man's eyes narrowed. He was maybe 30, scarred above one eyebrow, the kind of handsome that curdled the moment you saw what was underneath it. "Move," he said in accented English, clearly clocking her as foreign. "This isn't your business." "She's my friend, that makes it my business." Laughter ugly and short. "Friend cute." He raised the knife slightly, almost lazily testing her. And then a voice cut through the market like a blade through silk. "Enough." Every man in black froze. Not flinched, froze, the way soldiers freeze at the crack of a superior's voice. The knife disappeared into a sleeve so fast Victoria almost thought she'd imagined it. She turned. He was tall, taller than she'd expected from the voice, which had been quiet, almost bored, but carried the unmistakable weight of absolute authority. Black hair, a black shirt with the top buttons undone despite the evening chill, and ink crawling up from beneath his collar. She could see the edge of something dark and detailed at his throat, more hidden beneath the fabric. His eyes found hers first, then flicked to Halmoni's song, then to the rice scattered across the ground, and something in his jaw tightened so slightly she almost missed it. "Boss," the scarred man said, and the word landed in the market like a stone in still water. Nearby vendors who hadn't so much as glanced at the commotion before suddenly found urgent reasons to look elsewhere. Boss. Victoria's pulse spiked. She didn't understand everything about the market's underground rhythms yet, but she understood that word, understood the way grown men suddenly stood up straighter, understood the particular silence that fell like a curtain over the stalls around them. The man in black, the boss, crouched down without a word and began picking up the spilled rice himself, grain by grain, and placing it back into the torn bag. Halmoni's song made a small, strangled sound, somewhere between protest and disbelief. "Jinho," she whispered. Jinho, not boss, not a title, a name spoken the way only a mother speaks a name. Victoria's stomach turned to ice. He looked up at his mother, and for one unguarded second, the danger in his face dissolved into something raw and almost boyish: guilt, tenderness, an apology too large for words. Then he stood, dusted off his knees, and turned to the scarred man. He said something low in Korean, too fast and quiet for Victoria to catch, but she watched the man's face go pale, watched him nod frantically, watched all four men bow and practically flee the way they'd come. Then those dark eyes turned to her. "You," he said, in English so smooth it startled her, "you put yourself between my mother and a knife." "I didn't know he had a knife until it was already there," Victoria admitted, because apparently near-death honesty was her default setting. Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. Reckless. Someone had to be. He studied her for a long moment, the way you'd study something you hadn't expected to find and now couldn't quite look away from. Up close, the tattoos crept higher than she'd realized, dark ink disappearing beneath his collar, a hint of something sharp-edged at his wrist when his sleeve shifted. Everything about him said danger, and yet he'd knelt in the dirt for his mother without a second's hesitation. "Thank you," he said finally, quiet enough that it felt like it cost him something to say. Then, to his mother, gently, in Korean, before turning and walking away without looking back, though Victoria noticed, or thought she noticed, the way his eyes lingered on her reflection in a shop window as he left. Halmoni's song grabbed Victoria's wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. "You don't know what you just did," she said, her English halting but urgent. "You don't know who that is. He's your son." "He's Han Jinho." The old woman's eyes were wide, frightened, not of him, Victoria realized, but for her. "He runs everything east of the river. Everything. You understand. You don't cross men like him. You don't get noticed by men like him." Victoria looked down the street where he disappeared, that ink-dark silhouette swallowed by neon and crowd. "I already have," she whispered. "If you haven't hit subscribe yet, now's the time. This story only gets more intense from here." She told herself she wouldn't think about him. She lasted 2 days. On the third day, a car the color of wet obsidian pulled up outside her tiny apartment building, and a man in a suit, not one of the ones from the market, older, more composed, stepped out and asked, with excruciating politeness, whether she was Victoria. "Mr. Han would like to see you," he said, "to thank you properly." "I don't need to be thanked." "He insists." There was something about the way he said "insists" that made it clear this wasn't actually a request, however politely it was dressed. Victoria thought of Halmoni's song's frightened eyes, thought about the rumors she'd already half-heard whispered through the market in the 2 days since Han Jinho, the ghost of the eastern districts, the man who inherited his father's empire at 26 and buried anyone who challenged him for it, and felt something cold slide down her spine. She should say no. Every rational part of her screamed to say no. "Let me get my coat," she said instead. The restaurant was the kind of place that didn't have a sign, didn't have other customers, and definitely didn't have a menu with prices on it. Jinho was waiting at a private table in the back, dressed differently than before, a dark suit, sleeves rolled to reveal more of the ink she'd only glimpsed in the market. A dragon, she realized, coiling up his forearm, its claws disappearing beneath his cuff. Beautiful and violent in the same breath, much like the man wearing it. "You came," he said, sounding almost surprised. "Your man made it sound like I didn't have a choice." You always have a choice. He gestured to the seat across from him. I would have respected no. She sat, mostly because she didn't quite believe him and wanted to test the theory from a position where she could watch his face. Would you? I've never once forced a woman to do anything, he said, and something in his voice made it clear this was a point of genuine, almost wounded pride. I have done many things I'm not proud of. That isn't one of them. The waiter brought food without being asked, course after course of things Victoria couldn't name, delicate and precise, clearly chosen with more thought than a stranger's dinner should require. She found herself watching him instead of the food, the way his knuckles bore the faint white lines of old scars, the way his eyes never quite stopped scanning the room even as he spoke to her, a predator's habit worn so deep it had become unconscious. Why did you really bring me here? She asked finally. He was quiet for a moment, turning his glass slowly between two fingers. My mother has lived above that market for 11 years, since my father died. I offered her a house, an estate, security, anything. She refuses to leave. She says the market is the only place that still feels like before. His jaw tightened. Before I became what I am. And the men who threatened her. Lone sharks operating in my territory without my permission, using my name to intimidate without my authority. They are being dealt with. The way he said it left no room for imagination about what dealt with meant, and Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the restaurant's air conditioning. You could have protected her without me, almost getting my throat cut. I know. For the first time, something like shame crossed his face. I have eyes everywhere in that market. I saw them approach her 3 minutes before you did. I let it go on longer than I should have because I wanted to see. He stopped himself. See what? Whether anyone in that market actually cared about her, or if everyone was too afraid of my name to move. His eyes lifted to hers, dark and unreadable. You weren't afraid. You didn't even know who I was. I still don't, not really. No, he agreed quietly. You don't, and I'd like to keep it that way a little longer if I could. It should have been a warning. It landed instead like an invitation, and Victoria, who had crossed an ocean to build a life far from everything familiar, who had never once in her 24 years let danger stop her from doing what she believed was right, found herself leaning, infinitesimally, toward the flame. What followed was not a courtship. Courtship implied something gentler, something with edges softened by time. What followed was closer to gravity, inevitable, indifferent to whether either of them wanted to fall. He found reasons to see her. A car outside her building on nights she worked late at the market, for safety, though she suspected the danger he was protecting her from was largely danger he himself commanded. Flowers that arrived with no card because, she would learn later, he didn't trust himself to write anything that wouldn't reveal too much. A phone call at midnight when he couldn't sleep, his voice low and rough, asking about Lagos, about her mother, about a life so ordinary and sunlit it must have felt like a foreign country to a man who'd grown up learning which of his father's men could be trusted, and which were already plotting his death. Tell me about home, he said once, 3 weeks in, both of them sitting on the roof of her building because he refused to be seen taking her anywhere public more than once. Why do you want to know? Because you talk about it like it's still inside you, like it never left. He looked at the Seoul skyline, all glass and neon and ambition. I don't remember what that feels like. Home, for me, has always been something to defend, not something to miss. She told him about the smell of her mother's stew, about street vendors in Lagos who called her auntie, though she was younger than most of them, about the particular gold of West African sunsets that no photograph had ever quite captured. He listened the way starving men listen to descriptions of food, hungry, aching, half in disbelief that such things existed. It was during the 4th week that she learned what he did to a man who'd threatened his mother's stall a second time, after being warned once already. She hadn't meant to find out. She'd gone to the market early before dawn to help Halmoni Song with a delivery, and she'd seen the ambulance, the police tape, the particular grim quiet of men who'd witnessed something they wouldn't speak of. Halmoni Song had pulled her away before she could see too much, but the whispers followed her home, broken fingers, both hands. A message so the whole district would understand. She confronted him that night, furious, shaking. You said you protected her without needing to see me almost killed. This is what protection looks like to you. His face was carved from stone. That man put his hands on an elderly woman for the second time after being explicitly warned. In my world, mercy shown twice is read as weakness, and weakness gets people killed, including her. Including you, if anyone believed for a second that hurting you would go unanswered. That doesn't make it right. No, he agreed, and the admission cost him visibly. It doesn't, but it makes her safe, and it makes you safe. I have never once pretended to be a good man, Victoria. I told you who I am the moment you saw the tattoos, the men who bow to me, the fear in every eye in that market. You chose to keep looking at me anyway. She should have walked away then. Every instinct her mother had ever taught her screamed to walk away then. Instead, she stepped closer, close enough to see the flicker of surprise in his eyes, close enough to feel the tension radiating off him like heat off asphalt in summer. I'm not asking you to be a good man, she said quietly. I'm asking you to be honest with me, about all of it. No more protecting me from the truth by wrapping it in silence. Something in him seemed to crack open at that, not weakness, but relief. The particular relief of a man who has spent his entire adult life being feared and has forgotten what it feels like to simply be known. Okay, he said, voice rough, then ask me anything. She did, and that night, on the roof of her building with soul glittering beneath them like a field of fallen stars, he told her about his father's death, not natural, never natural in his world, about the 26-year-old boy who'd had to bury his grief in less than a day, because rivals were already circling, about every decision that had hardened him into the man who now sat beside her with ink crawling up his arms like armor grown from skin. And when he finally leaned in, slow enough that she could have stopped him 100 times over, she didn't stop him at all. This is the part where things get dangerous. Don't miss what's coming. Subscribe now if you haven't already, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Love, in Jin Ho's world, was never a private thing. It became a weapon the moment his enemies learned of it. His name was Kwon Tae-min, the boss of the Western Syndicate, a man who had spent 3 years chipping away at the fragile peace Jin Ho's father had built before he died, waiting for the right moment to strike at the son who'd inherited an empire without, in Tae-min's estimation, having earned it in blood. He found his moment in Victoria. It happened on an ordinary Thursday. Victoria was walking home from the university library, earbuds in, mind full of half-finished coursework, when a black car, different from Jin Ho's fleet, she'd learn later, an unfamiliar make with tinted windows too dark to be legal, slowed beside her on an empty street. She didn't even have time to run. She woke in a room with no windows, wrists bound to a chair, and a man sitting across from her with a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. You must be the girl, he said, in English polished by some foreign university. The one who's made our friend Han Jin-ho so distracted lately. I have to say, I expected someone more impressive. Who are you? Someone who's been waiting 3 years for Han Jin-ho to make a mistake. He crouched to her eye level, studying her the way a collector studies a rare, unexpected specimen. And here you are, his mistake, wrapped in a pretty bow. Terror should have swallowed her whole. In some distant part of her mind, it did. She could feel her pulse hammering, feel the cold sweat at the back of her neck. But louder than the fear was something else. Something that had carried her across an ocean and put her body between an old woman and a blade without a second's hesitation. If you think I'm his weakness, she said, voice steadier than she felt, you clearly don't understand what you're dealing with. Min laughed, delighted. Oh, I understand perfectly. Every king has one thing he'd burn his kingdom down to protect. I've spent 3 years looking for Jinho's. Turns out it isn't money or territory or even his precious mother. His smile sharpened. It's you. He sent the photograph himself. Victoria, bound and terrified, time-stamped, delivered directly to Jinho's private number with a single message. Come alone, or she disappears the way your father did. What happened next would become market legend, whispered for years afterward in the alleys of both districts. A story mothers would tell to explain why no one crossed Han Jinho twice. He came alone, as instructed. But alone for Han Jinho meant something different than Min had accounted for, because Jinho had spent 11 years since his father's death making sure that no warehouse, no safe house, no hidden room in either district existed without at least one loyal set of eyes watching it, waiting for exactly this kind of moment. Victoria heard the gunfire before she saw him, heard shouting chaos, the particular silence that follows violence when it finally stops. And then the door burst open, and Jinho was there, blood on his knuckles that wasn't his own, eyes wild in a way she'd never seen. Every ounce of the composed, controlled man she'd fallen for burned away and replaced with something ancient and furious and utterly without mercy. He crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees in front of her chair, hands shaking, actually shaking. This man who never seemed to feel fear, as he worked at the ropes binding her wrists. I'm here, he said, voice breaking on the words. I'm here, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. Jinho, she caught his face in her freed hands, forcing him to look at her to see that she was breathing whole, alive. I'm okay, look at me, I'm okay. Behind him, in the doorway, 2 of his men dragged Min forward, bloodied and broken but alive. Because, she would learn, Jinho had made a very specific decision in the chaos of the rescue, a decision that surprised even his own men. Kill me then, Min spat, blood in his teeth, still smiling even now. Isn't that what you do? Jinho stood slowly, Victoria's hand still gripped in his like an anchor, and looked down at the man who'd spent 3 years trying to destroy him. No, he said quietly, killing you would make you a martyr. Every rival I have left would rally behind your memory. He crouched to Min's level, voice dropping to something colder than Victoria had ever heard from him. Instead, everyone in both districts is going to know exactly how this ended, that the great Kwon Min took a woman hostage to draw out an enemy. And that enemy took everything from him anyway, his men, his territory, his reputation, and let him live to watch it happen. There is no version of that story where you come out as anything but a cautionary tale. He straightened, and Victoria watched the fury slowly bleed out of his shoulders, replaced by something exhausted and raw. Take him to the harbor safe house, he told his men. Alive, watched. He doesn't so much as breathe near my territory again. Then he turned back to Victoria, and every wall he'd built over 11 years of careful control seemed to simply dissolve. I almost lost you, he whispered, forehead dropping to hers. Because of who I am, because of what I chose to become. You didn't lose me. Her hands found the sides of his face, steady now despite everything. You came for me, that's what matters. It shouldn't have to be a choice between loving you and keeping you safe. His voice cracked on the words. But it always will be, as long as I'm this man. Then let me choose it anyway, she said fiercely. Let me choose you, danger and all, the way you didn't choose the empire you were born into but carried it anyway. I'm not asking you to be safe, Jinho. I'm asking you to let me stand beside you while you're dangerous. He kissed her then, in the wreckage of the safe house with blood still drying on his knuckles, the way a drowning man kisses air, like it was the only thing keeping him alive. Almost at the end now. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next in this world. Peace, when it finally came, was not soft. It was earned the way everything in Jinho's world was earned, through blood, negotiation, and the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent his whole life at war finally choosing, deliberately, to lay down some of his weapons. He didn't leave the life. That would have been a lie neither of them could live inside. But he restructured it, pulled back from the smaller cruelties, tightened his circle to men he actually trusted, began, slowly, the impossible work of trying to be something other than only feared. Halmoni's song still ran her stall in the market. She still slipped Victoria extra kimchi, though now she did it with a knowing, teasing smile that made Victoria's face burn every time. "You saved me that day," the old woman told her once, gripping her hand with that same surprising strength. "But I think in the end you saved him more." 6 months after the knife in the market, on the same rooftop where he'd first told her about his father, Jinho knelt in front of her. No bodyguards, no audience, just the two of them and the glittering skyline he'd once called something to defend rather than something to love. "I can't promise you safety," he said, voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "I can't promise you an ordinary life or a quiet one or one without danger finding us again. But I can promise you that from the moment you stepped between my mother and a blade, I have never once wanted anyone else beside me. Marry me, Victoria, not because it's safe, because it's true." She said yes before he'd even finished the sentence, because some loves aren't chosen for their safety, but for the terrifying, magnetic truth of them, and because Victoria had learned, in the 6 weeks and 6 months since she'd first arrived in Seoul, that courage had never once been about the absence of danger. It had always only been about choosing to stand your ground anyway. Wow, okay, what a ride. If you made it all the way to the end, I want to know, where are you watching this from and what time is it right now for you? Drop it in the comments. And before you go, tell me the 3 major lessons you took from Victoria and Jinho's story. What stuck with you? If you haven't already, hit subscribe now. There's more where this came from.